So yeah, Martin talked about the competence framework and the fact that there are almost as many definitions for competence as there is competence and training professionals working around this town. And having spent 4 or 5 years as a training competence professional and been part of that mire of self-promotion, having a standard definition is, I think, really, really important to us. So where do we start? Well, I guess the simple place to start for me is this. Now, for those of you that are kind of, some of them look a bit more tattered and battered than this, but this is my driving license. This is my certificate of competence to operate a car in the UK. Now, to put that into context, I passed my test in Orkney, in Kirkwall, in 1985. We had no traffic lights, we had no roundabouts, we had single-file roads, no dual carriageway, and the fastest I was legally allowed to go was 60 miles an hour. But because I have this, my certificate of competence, I can do whatever I want anywhere else in the rest of this country. So my experience base is quite limited. The major hazard I had to watch out for when driving was sheep on the road. And that license allows me to operate probably the most dangerous thing I do on a day-to-day basis without any consequence, without the need to demonstrate currency or anything else. So when we look at competence as an industry, these things do not make us competent. They're very useful in terms of showing we've passed the test, but they don't drive competence. Since we're talking about signs and roads and everything else and driving, this is the challenge that I had to grow up with. So now it's a small place and all roads lead to the same part. We know this. But there we go. So when we think about competence, we have to think about the conditions of managing our people risk in our business. How do we set people up for success? And how do we use our environment, our learning environment, to drive a good outcome from an individual perspective? Now, this license is really good because I moved house about 8 months ago, and there are no more points on it because they took it off. So this actually shows I truly am competent. There are no misdemeanors on it. But that perception of consequence is fundamentally important for us. So when we look at definitions as an industry, we have some very simple definitions from an offshore sector and our sort of guiding documents, the Health and Safety at Work Act. And there's nothing in that about competence. Nothing at all. And yet, we have thousands of people spending thousands of hours every week on doing something. And it actually talks about information, instruction, training, and supervision. So supervision is a fundamental part of competence for an individual to ensure the health and safety. And of course, we have the ALARP principle in there. So that's our guiding regulation and what we should be striving to achieve. The management regs add in the word competent, and they talk about sufficient training, experience, knowledge, and this great word, other qualities. Now, what on earth is an other quality? How do you demonstrate that? How do you actually become prescriptive and manage that? So what we do is we start creating our own definitions, our own competitive environment, and actually as an industry, we compete on competence as a differentiator. Now, when you're a contractor, having to compete on competence as a differentiator is pretty difficult. And as an individual, as a worker, you're having to demonstrate how good you are to every single paymaster that you might come across in a particular year. So the need for standardization is quite important in that regard. So if you think about where we may have been, and we think about this actually talks about a basic level of knowledge, a very basic level of experience. You combine those two things, and the good thing is that what we get is a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling about this is what competence is. And that does not give you a predictable outcome time and time again. And particularly when we looked at the first section on human factors, when we were managing human error, there's nothing in here in terms of competence and how we do that. So how do you manage the, let's say, ongoing challenge of people making mistakes in a competence framework? It's not to say that people can't be competent, but it's having to address the issue that people are not always competent because there are behavioral issues or, let's say, other pressures in terms of stress and everything else that drive a set of outcomes. So competence-based qualifications as themselves are just a little bit too simplistic and go back to the driving license, a competence-based qualification. So when we started this work in Step Change, we had to go and look for other examples of good practice. The first piece of good practice we had to do was we had to recognize there are two industry sector skills bodies. So we have APITO down at Portlethen doing the great work they do, but we also have ECITB, and if you work in a contracting company and you're paying levy, it's really, really important to have them at the table. And for an industry, it's important for us to have both of them at the table. So the work we're doing ultimately will produce a jointly badged Step Change, ECITB, and APITO framework around what competence is. So it will be this overarching framework. It's not about how to run your management system, because that's your job. It's about what your management system should be trying to achieve and the principles that should exist within it. So we went and had a look at CDM, the Construction Design and Management Regs in 2007. And one of the reasons that we went to have a look at CDM was in my previous life in a major contractor, we had an unfortunate incident, and the first thing the lawyer said to me was, go and have a look at CDM and be able to demonstrate that you achieved everything against this standard, because that's the nearest comparable standard in his eyes to what we're doing offshore. Very sobering when we started unpicking this to see what we were doing and what we were not doing. So CDM has some definitions, not only at an organizational, but an individual level. And you can look at organizational competence in exactly the same light as individual competence. And it's quite important to recognize that we have to demonstrate our competence, not just as people, but at organizations in terms of knowledge and experience and exposure to risk that we have. So they say you must have sufficient knowledge of the specific tasks you're about to undertake and the risks that they will entail. So knowledge, task knowledge, but also an understanding of the risk, not a generic overview of single track roads, 30 mile an hour, and no traffic lights or anything else. So it begins to unpick that model. But it also says you have to have experience and ability, recognize your own limitations, take appropriate action, and prevent harm. So that actually puts a lot on an individual to recognize their own limitations. So you need to know what you can do, but actually to be competent, you also need to know what you can't do, so that you avoid what Catherine talked about, is this kind of, the human error, the human violation, but also the human hero, the guy who's wanting to do a good job. So that's really, really important. They also talked about how you assess it, and it should be a two-stage process. So you assess a person's task knowledge, whether they have the sufficient knowledge to carry out the task you're actually asking them to do, and do it without risk to their health and safety. And do an assessment of the individual's experience. Have they done this work before or recently? And are they able to carry out the work in a safe, consistent manner, recognizing their limitations? So those two things talk about both knowledge and experience. But when you add in human error, you have to go one stage further. So when you get a number of competence professionals in a room, it's a bit like getting a number of human factor specialists in the room. And we had to have one common definition. So this was the kind of mantra that we worked with. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. So as simple as it possibly can be, but let's not dumb down the agenda. Because this is about managing risk in our business. Competence is about the quality assurance of people. It's not a product of learning and development. It is it's an assurance process and a demonstration process. So the definition the group came up with, and that it's a conscious combination, the consistent demonstration and application of current skills, knowledge, and behavior against a defined performance standard over a period of time. So it's not a one-off in a lifetime, license to behave badly for the rest of your days. It's that consistent demonstration and application of skills, but also over a period of time. So it's giving that sense of currency, but it adds in behavior, that fact that we manage the human error, that we talked about earlier in human factors. So what we said, it's a product. It's a product of knowledge. It's a product of skill. Now, skill is different from experience, and we'll come back to why that's different in a little while. And then behavior. That then gives us a competence model. So if we look at knowledge, look at skill, look at behavior across those three pieces, we have a consistent set of language for understanding what we're trying to achieve when we talk about competence. So knowledge is really simple. We're good at this. We're very, very good at this. We're very good at having competence management systems with thousands of sheets of paper in it. Yeah? The training courses, the competence certificates, everything else we go through. But it's that awareness and understanding gained through experience and study. Measured and recorded through evaluation of demonstrable education and training. Training records, qualifications, continuous professional development, NVQs, so they're not all things, or competence-based qualifications. And actually, if you have sufficient time served in a role, that's a demonstration of knowledge. So this gives us a cornerstone on which to build. The developed ability, skill. This comes from the practical application of your knowledge and actually the consolidation of your training. The important thing about skill is that it has to have currency. So both Dave and Tom spoke about how long they've been in industry. I started life offshore as an instrument technician. I would say today, quite safely, that I have no current competence as an instrument technician. I have all the knowledge, I have all the certificates, I have X number of years offshore experience, but the last time I turned a spanner in anger was to change the brakes in my car. I would never let me near a DCS or a flow meter offshore. So that currency of competence is really important. It's more important as we become more and more active, as people return to an industry that's actually buoyant. You know, in the last year, we went from 22,000 to 25,000 core workers offshore. So that's 3,000 people returning to industry. What were they doing before they came back? Where were they working? Were they working in a downstream sector on a coma site with similar hazards? Or were they doing something entirely different, driving a taxi or working in Tesco's? Now, the risks in those two environments are very different. So understanding that currency is fundamentally important to understand the people risk that you import into your business, particularly around turnaround and shutdown, when you're bringing additional personnel back onto your installation. So currency of skill is equally as important as the experience you've got. Think about that from your onshore perspective in engineering. Senior engineers, technical authorities, very, very well qualified, degrees, fellowships, all these kinds of things. When was the last time they did continuous professional development? What's their currency like? And they're making really, really strategic decisions around the integrity of assets and installations. So from a major accident hazard perspective, these guys are fundamental. And we will spend arguably more time demonstrating the competence of a rigger offshore than we will on a project manager or a technical authority or an engineer. Now, the ability to cause harm at site from a rigger might be a lot, but that might be one or two people. If a technical authority gets it wrong, you're talking about a significantly higher number. So when we look at competence, this is not the challenge for an offshore sector or the offshore workforce. This is a challenge for us all as individuals to actually understand our own competence and our organizational competence in that regard. Behavior. This is really simple. We're good at this again. We've got lots of behavioral standards. Dave at Wood Group's got their behavioral standards and their expectations, as do many, many companies. But it's the way in which a person acts and conducts themselves in any situation. So to put this into context, I'll go back to driving. So a number of years ago, in a previous life, I was sitting in the office about 3:30 in the afternoon, and I get a call from my wife. And she says, "Les, can you please go and pick up Megan from school?" Megan was at primary school at that stage. "I've got a flat tire, and I'm not going to get there in time." So this is 3:30. I'm in Dice, West Hill. It's 20 minutes away. So I'll easily get there by 4 o'clock. No issues. So I leave the office. By the time I turn off my PC, clear my desk, get down into the car, it's now 25 to 4. Plenty of time, still 5 minutes spare. So as I go through the traffic lights at the at the bottom of the road. I'm going, yeah, fine, they're green, 30 mile an hour, no issues. So I'm very happy with that. I'm driving the car competently. I'm following the rules, the highway code, as Tom showed. I'm compliant with my certificate of competence that I showed you earlier. The bad news is that DICE is not the easiest place to move around. And as you get closer to 4 o'clock, it becomes harder and harder and harder. So as I reach the first set of traffic lights, where Survivex and that are now, you can see the traffic lights are a bit backed up. Somebody in front of me is going a little bit slower than I would like them to go. And as I get to the traffic lights, I've got this sense that they're about to change. So I entirely, for the best of reasons, because I've got to get home, the consequence of not picking up my daughter is much greater than the consequence of being caught or fined by the police. So I go from 30 to 35 mile an hour and glide blissfully through the traffic lights, entirely happy with my choices that I make. So you look at that that influencing factors. As we get further down the road, the roundabout at the bottom of the main road is really, really busy. So I'm stuck in traffic. So I'm losing time all the way. And as I ultimately get to around Bass Kingswells and I get to the traffic lights there, I'm kind of making the decision that I now only have 10 minutes to get to West Hill. Now, probably okay, and as I blast through the amber going to red, there's an awful lot of green left in that light, at 40 miles an hour around the roundabout, I am then no longer competent. I can't be competent because I'm not following the rules to a defined standard. I still have this wonderful sheet of paper that says I am legally allowed to drive a car, but my competence is affected by my behavior and my perception of the risk. I'm putting myself at risk, I'm putting other people at risk, and I'm making behavioral choices in terms of what I see as the most important thing. And the most important thing to me is be at school by 4 o'clock, because the consequence for me of not meeting that, my daughter, is that I'm going to get bawled out by the wife. Yeah? So no perception of risk to anybody else. So that's the modifying behavior. So when we think about behavior and competence, it's a really significant part of reducing or improving the likelihood of having a consistently good outcome. Now, that doesn't mean to say that my capability changed. My ability to drive the car to the standards, to the legal requirements, remains the same. But the behavior, the influencing factors, fatigue and stress, drive a set of outcomes. So when we think about competence, we have to see it as a live thing, a consistently living being in terms of how a person may or may not show up. One of the things I have a strong belief in, and one of the things that the group's been talking about, is you can't develop competence. When you look at it from an organizational perspective, you assess competence. It's an output of all the other things you do. As an individual, you demonstrate competence, but as an organization, you assess it. So it's not a product of learning and development, so to speak. But if you have, this model allows you to have a better view of where your intervention or your, let's say, development area is. So if you have a behavioral issue, you coach. So you coach, mentor for behavior. If you have a skill issue, so if somebody doesn't have the necessary experience, you need to give them more time. If they don't have the currency, you develop and you mentor that currency. You manage the risk in that way. It doesn't mean you shouldn't employ them. It just means you have to understand that risk, mitigate against it, and put in an appropriate supervision or buddy to manage that so you get them back up to being current. And if you have a knowledge gap, send them on a course, put them back to university, educate, train, and engage them in that way. So having a simple model like this helps you define the intervention that you need at each stage. This way, you can kind of work things back, and therefore you don't have suddenly trying to give this huge coaching solution to a knowledge gap. It just won't give you the right outcome. So in practice, what does this mean? We have a standard sort of 4-stage model. This is kind of applied in a competence sense. But we can start the competence assessment at recruitment. It doesn't start the day they arrive on the installation. It starts at recruitment. It's making sure you have a good person spec, good understanding of the skills and the tasks you're needing to do. Why would you recruit somebody to work in a confined space if they've never worked in a confined space before? Understand the risks, understand what you're wanting to achieve. You don't need everybody to do everything. You need them to do the job that they're doing safely and well, consistently. So you can make that basic assessment from day one, so you understand the risk that you may or may not be importing into your business. We have probation, 90 days typically. We can make a basic assessment in the first 90 days of somebody's behavior, how they're showing up, how they're demonstrating their skill. So you don't have to wait 2 years, You don't have to wait 2 years to do a huge competence-based assessment. There's nothing in any of the regulations that say competence, you're allowed to wait 2 years to demonstrate competence. An individual is as likely to be involved in an accident on the first day on the installation or as the last day on the installation. So we have to see this as from day one expectation, rather than having these long, protracted processes. It's about managing your risk and doing everything that is reasonable and practicable from day one. And what's reasonable and practicable at day one and day 101 is different, because it's like a relationship. So if you see this as a relationship, stage one, I would maybe like to go on a date with this person. Stage two, that initial assessment, is the first date went well, so actually I'm going to go on a second date. Stage three is actually the dates have been going really, really well, and we're probably going to get married. And then you think about, so the more you know, and actually stage four is, goodness me, I've been married for 25 years, and, am I still happy? And whilst that is a little bit, so I've only been married 22 years, so I've got 3 years to worry with that question. But I'm not sure the wife has the same length of time on that as me. But you think about this in terms of how we manage relationships and how we manage where people are at. But you do these at different stages. Stage four is actually the most important thing. Is how do you continue to demonstrate competence? So once you've got your piece of paper, how do you continue to do it? Do you do it through your appraisal process? Do you do it through a continuous assessment? If you haven't done a task in the previous year, are you still competent? If you've changed roles in the previous year, are you still competent? So if you think about it as a management of change process around people, that gives you an idea of what we're trying to achieve. And what's reasonable and practicable changes as you go through the stages. So what you can do in 90 days is not the same as what you can do in 2 years, and 3 years, and 4 years. So the expectation has to change. You know more about a person, so you should be able to make better-based competence decisions. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of thinking. So a very simple framework, guiding principles, clear definition of where the intervention should be, and actually a basic process of how to achieve it. Not a prescriptive management system, because actually that exists. Most companies have one. It will be very much linked to the APITO competence framework assessment process and validation process as a sense of giving us an outcome. So they accredit competence management systems. This gives us a sense of what we should be trying to achieve. So the accreditation will link directly to both of these things. So what you have is a good measurement outcome. So rather than just creating yet more shelfware, this gives us, through APITO, the ability to see if that shelfware is being applied and implemented on an ongoing basis. So I'll leave you with one last slide. This is another picture from Orkney, and I'll let you decide what you think.
Pointing at you.
That was why I let you decide what you think, Andy. It's a real place. Yeah. So that's competence. So it's just to give you a heads up of where we're at, what we're trying to achieve. It is work in progress. We've got a really good, strong group, and we'll continue to keep you updated as it goes. So now I'm going to introduce Emily Taylor and Harry van der Vossen. Emily's one of the step change analysts who has been working with us for nearly a year now. I think it's only 1 week less than a year. And she has been working along with APITO on the review of MIST. The standard is up for review right now. And one of the things we want to do, and one of the challenges we have as an industry, is how MIST is working for us. Is it working for us? What more can we do? How do we improve it, and all these things? And Harry's going to give us some really interesting insight into the data that we've captured from the online MIST training, which is effectively a stage 3 for existing workers demonstration of training. And we've got nearly 70,000 data points in there that we're able to analyse and give us some really interesting insight as to where our challenges and opportunities might be with regard to MIST going forward. So I'm going to introduce Emily first, and then Harry will come on after her. Thank you.